Imagine that you're trying to live peacefully after just having gotten out of a war, but it's hard to do, and then it gets even harder. You're cut off from the world, and your only hope for survival is help from the outside world. You now have to ration your food, clothes, coal, and other goods. This is how 2 million people were living for a year during the Berlin blockade and airlift of 1948.
As World War II started to wrap up in the mid-1940s, the Allied powers were forced to decide how post-World War II Europe should be dealt with. The USSR hoped to maintain a buffer zone of satellite states around it, as well as keep Germany weak. The US and other Western powers wanted to see Europe, including Germany, grow stronger and more stable.
Although the Soviet Union had fought with the Allies against Germany, tensions rose between them over how Europe should be divided. In 1945, the Yalta Conference was held to discuss these plans and agreed that free elections would be allowed in Central and Eastern Europe, and that Germany and Berlin would split up into four occupation zones controlled by the US, the USSR, the UK, and France.
The Potsdam Conference in 1945 was meant to settle disputes occurring over the divisions of Germany made at the Yalta Conference. However, it was decided to push the discussion of German reunification to a later date. Later conflict could have likely been prevented if the nation's future had not been left so unclear.
In 1947, the US and UK unified their occupation zones to create Bizonia so that they could facilitate the administration, centralize their economies. But the USSR saw this joining of forces as a threatening move. When France began to merge its section of Germany with Bizonia, initiating the formation of Trizonia, aka West Germany, the Soviets withdrew their contact from the Allies.
The U.S. also announced the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, which emphasized the containment of communism and offered financial aid to help reconstruction in Europe after World War II. This aid was available to Eastern Europe, although the USSR viewed this as a way to promote capitalism and gain control of Western Europe, as well as infiltrate Stalin's sphere of influence.
In an effort to stabilize the economy, a new currency, the Deutschmark, was introduced in West Germany without Soviet permission. The US and UK hoped to take over economic control from the Soviets, but the Soviets instead responded by issuing their own currency in East Germany. For the USSR, the introduction of the Deutschmark was the last straw, and it was what finally initiated the Berlin blockade.
Less than a week after the initiation of the Deutschmark, the Berlin blockade began. All land and water travel into West Berlin was halted. In response, 2 days later, the Western Allies stepped in and initiated the Berlin airlift. It was codenamed Operation Vittles by the U.S., Vittles meaning food prepared to be eaten.
Once West Berlin's previously stockpiled goods ran out, they were completely dependent on the airlift. Every day they received over 1,500 tons of food, half of which was flour, wheat, and cereal. The thing they needed the most was coal, which was used primarily for industry, but also for things like heating homes.
The large amount of supplies being flown in every day still wasn't enough to stop the shortages. Every little thing was rationed, from salt to clothes to fuel. Even energy was very limited, since Berlin's power plant was located in East Berlin. Gas and electricity were only available a few hours per day.
Simply put, life for the West Berliners was hard. The city's trees were cut down for heating homes, garbage was regularly rummaged through for food scraps, and grass was even being eaten as people became desperate. This resulted in short tempers and the creation of a widely used underground black market where most people's goods had to be bought.
One of the most famous symbols of the airlift was U.S. Lieutenant Gale S. Halverson, the Candy Bomber. He organized what became known as Operation Little Vittles, in which he dropped candy in parachutes from his plane to the children waiting below. This started simply as a small, kind-hearted gesture, but in the end, over 3 tons of candy were dropped over Berlin.
Although West Berliners were forced to endure tough times during the blockade, nearly all were in complete support of the Western Allies' refusal to surrender the city. They preferred limited rations to the treatment they knew they would receive from the Soviets. When the airlift was announced, many West Berliners volunteered to lend a hand in the airlift both in gratitude and for extra rations.
A large majority of people in Western nations supported the Berlin airlift. The protection of the city became a matter of national pride, as letting it fall would tarnish the U.S.'s image. The USSR was seen as the malicious party in the conflict, while the U.S. and UK were the heroes who saved the West Berliners through their humanitarian efforts.
Most people in the USSR had mixed feelings about maintaining control in West Berlin. The economic cost of the blockade and the Cold War in general was high and caused taxes to increase and food shortages to occur. Lots of people were dissatisfied with the life in the Soviet Union and therefore were not fully behind the continuation of the blockade.
On May 12, 1949, the Soviets ended the blockade. Much to the relief of the West Berliners, travel in and out of the area resumed. The airlift, however, didn't officially end for several more months, as the Allies wanted to build up a supply of goods in Berlin before they called it off. This was one of the first battles fought in the Cold War without any direct violence.
The Berlin blockade and airlift had a major role in shaping the U.S. Cold War foreign policy. The U.S. got on good terms with Germany, but officially ended any remaining friendship with the Soviet Union. The crisis amped up tensions between the U.S. and the USSR, tensions that would last several decades. The airlift was evidence that even then the U.S. was guided by its policy of containment of communism.
Another outcome was the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a continuation of the cooperative efforts between the Western nations and was a sign that the US's isolationist days were gone for good. The Soviet Union responded with its very own Warsaw Pact, in which it declared itself to be allied with its satellite states.
While the blockade was over, the Cold War was only beginning. Over the course of the blockade, the West Berlin had become a Cold War symbol, and the U.S. made sure it represented freedom and not Soviet power. In the following years, two countries would compete in a large-scale arms race, and the U.S. would again become involved overseas.
There was no one reason as to why the Berlin blockade began. There were several economic and social factors, but for the most part the reasons were political. When the Soviets did not get what they wanted after World War II and felt as if their power was being threatened, they reacted by starting the blockade. These actions ramped up the tensions that were already building that would eventually lead to the Cold War.